There is a number that Carl Jung wrote down in his private journals late in his career, after decades of studying the rarest category of human mind he had ever encountered. He never published it in a clinical paper. He never mentioned it in a lecture. But he believed, with the quiet conviction of someone who had seen too many cases to doubt himself, that the developmental arc of the most deeply intuitive personality type peaks not at 22, not at 30, but somewhere between 35 and 55. Not because these individuals are lazy, not because they are damaged, but because the architecture of their mind is simply too large to complete itself on the same timeline as everyone else. You are probably watching this video because some part of you has already suspected this about yourself. You look around at 30 or 35 or 40 and you see people who seem to have arrived somewhere, a career, a certainty, a version of themselves that appears finished, and you are still becoming, still unresolved, still feeling like the world is moving at a speed you cannot quite match. What if that feeling is not a failure? What if it is the most accurate data point your mind has ever produced? To answer that question, we have to go somewhere most INFJ content refuses to go. We have to look at the thing that happens before the rise, the long, quiet, largely invisible period that the psychology of peak performance has historically misread as stagnation. Because what looks like falling behind from the inside of a mind like yours is something else entirely. And the evidence for this has been sitting in plain sight for nearly a century. Carl Jung identified a cognitive function he called introverted intuition, not a feeling, not a style of thinking, a specific neurological orientation that he believed only a small fraction of the population possessed as their primary mode of processing reality. He described it as the perception of inner images and archetypal patterns, a direct, non-rational access to the deep structure of things, the ability to perceive not what is in front of you, but what is becoming. Neuroscience has since given this a more clinical name: default mode network dominance. When your brain is at rest, most people's minds drift or idle. The brain of a dominant introverted intuition user keeps working. It keeps synthesizing. It keeps finding connections between things that have no visible surface relationship. It is running a long computation that never fully completes because the data it is integrating is not limited to the present room, the present conversation, or the present decade. It is integrating patterns that span years. This is the reason the young INFJ feels chronically slow. Your brain is not slow. It is running a process so complex, so metabolically expensive, and so architecturally ambitious that it consumes enormous resources that other people spend on social maneuvering, career positioning, and identity performance. While your peers at 23 are investing their cognitive energy into learning the rules of a particular game, you are unconsciously studying the game beneath the game, the invisible structure that no one around you seems to notice, and that is a profoundly isolating place to live. A 2019 study by neuroscientist Roger Beatty at Penn State University identified a specific network pattern in highly creative individuals. The distinctive signature of their brain function was not just high activity in the default mode network. It was the unusual simultaneous activation of the default mode network and the executive control network, two systems that in most people operate in opposition. This dual activation is what allows certain minds to access deep, associative, nonlinear thinking while also maintaining the discipline to organize and express it. The catch is that building this neural architecture takes time. It cannot be rushed. It is not the kind of intelligence that shows up on standardized tests at 21. It is the kind that compounds silently over decades. This is the cognitive reality behind what feels, from the inside, like being left behind. The traditional systems you were placed inside during your formative years were not built for this kind of mind. Schooling, as it has existed for the past 2 centuries, is an optimization engine for convergent thinking. Speed, memorization, correct answers under artificial time pressure. The INFJ brain is a divergent processing machine operating at a resolution most systems cannot recognize, let alone reward. You were not slow in those classrooms. You were running a different program on hardware that the evaluation criteria were never designed to measure. And so a pattern formed. The feedback you received from institutions and early professional environments told you repeatedly that you were somehow insufficient, too quiet, too hesitant, too focused on questions nobody had asked yet. You internalized this as evidence of a deficiency when it was actually evidence of a mismatch. A profound and irreconcilable mismatch between the speed at which your mind needed to operate and the speed at which the world was asking you to perform. That mismatch has a cost, not just professionally, psychologically. Many INFJs arrive at their late 20s carrying a specific weight that almost no one around them can see. It is not depression, though it can resemble it. It is not anxiety, though it produces anxiety. It is closer to what the philosopher Albert Camus described as the absurd, the gap between what the mind intuitively understands about the world and what the world is actually prepared to hear. You have spent years operating at a depth that your environment could not receive, and that unreceived depth accumulates. It becomes a kind of loneliness that has no adequate name in most languages. Not loneliness for company, loneliness for comprehension. This is the pressure that builds in the first half of an INFJ's life, and it is also, paradoxically, the pressure that makes the second half extraordinary. Around the age of 30, give or take a few years in either direction depending on the individual, something shifts. Jung called it individuation. Not a sudden event, not a revelation, a slow, irreversible integration. The moment when the INFJ stops trying to translate themselves into a language that was never built to contain them. The moment when the enormous internal architecture that has been under construction for 3 decades finally reaches a threshold of coherence. What follows is not dramatic, at least not from the outside. The INFJ does not suddenly become louder. They do not acquire ambition that looks like anyone else's ambition. What happens is quieter and far more consequential. They stop leaking energy into performance. They stop apologizing for the pace at which they move. They stop seeking permission from systems that were never qualified to evaluate them. And when you stop spending 30% of your available cognitive bandwidth on managing the anxiety of being misunderstood, something remarkable happens to what remains. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who spent 3 years in Nazi concentration camps and emerged to write one of the most enduring works in clinical psychology, described a concept he called tragic optimism, the capacity to say yes to life in spite of everything, not despite the suffering of the early years, but through it. He was not writing about INFJs specifically, but the principle describes their developmental arc with a precision that is almost uncomfortable to read. The suffering of the early years is not separate from the capacity of the mature years. It is its raw material. Your decades of hypervigilance gave you a precision reader of human behavior that cannot be taught in any graduate program. Your years of carrying other people's emotional weight gave you a level of empathic intelligence that most leaders will spend their entire careers pretending to have. Your season of silent observation, which looked to everyone around you like passivity, was building a model of the world that is now, at last, calibrated enough to act on. This is the precise mechanism behind late INFJ success. Not luck, not sudden discipline. The completion of a construction project that started before you were fully aware it was happening. Jung's concept of individuation culminates in what he called the self, not the ego, not the social persona. The integrated totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, unified into something coherent enough to move through the world without constant internal war. He believed most people never reach it. He believed the INFJ, if they survive the first half without entirely shutting down, arrives there with a force that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not experienced it. If you are somewhere in the middle of this arc right now, if you are in the exhausted, unclear, unrewarded season that precedes the integration, then the single most important thing you can do is refuse the verdict of environments that were measuring the wrong thing. Your timeline is not a character flaw. It is the shape of the process. The supercomputer does not apologize for taking longer to render the image. It simply produces something that the faster machines were never capable of generating. Drop the word unstoppable in the comments if this reached you where you are tonight. Not as a performance, as a signal, so that others still in the dark part of the arc know they are not as alone as it feels. Subscribe to the rare axis. The architecture of your mind is still being mapped, and the most important discoveries are still ahead.